Before we get into 1918, we need to understand how Austro-Hungary had survived previous existential crises. Because throughout the 19th century, the empire faced repeated threats to its existence. Yet each time it was saved not by its own strength, but by an international system that needed it to survive. Let's start with 1848 to 1849, the period of revolutions in the empire. Nationalist uprisings erupted across the Habsburg lands. The Hungarians under Lajos Kossuth nearly won their complete independence. The Italian territories were in revolt, the Czechs were demanding autonomy, and the empire seemed on the verge of complete disintegration. And so it begs the question, what saved Austria-Hungary during these critical years? It wasn't Habsburg military power, because after all, the Austrian armies were being handed defeats in battles with the Hungarians who were in rebellion. What saved Austria-Hungary in the end was arguably Russian intervention. Tsar Nicholas I sent his Russian troops to crush the Hungarians, and he didn't do this out of love for the Habsburgs, but because the great powers of Europe, including Russia and Britain, all benefited from Austro-Hungary's survival. Because at the end of the day, its existence was necessary as a buffer state between the other major powers. Europe needed Austro-Hungary to maintain the balance of power and couldn't afford its collapse. Without Austro-Hungary, the continent would be dominated by either Prussia pushing southeast or Russia pushing southwest. And so Austro-Hungary served a very delicate purpose, to prevent either Prussia or Russia from getting too powerful. If we fast forward to 1866, where Prussia defeats Austria in a quick decisive war, the Austrian army is crushed at the Battle of Königsgrätz. Prussia now has a clear path to Vienna, and in 1866, Bismarck really had the opportunity to eliminate Austria from the map entirely. It would totally have played into his hand because he would have been able to unify all German-speaking territories under Prussian leadership. But he didn't. His king Wilhelm wanted exactly that, but Bismarck overruled his own leader. Not out of mercy, but because of calculation. He needed Austria intact as a future ally against France, who, for Bismarck, is way scarier. Destroying Austria would only create a vengeful enemy on Germany's southern border, and so Austria survives because it still has a function to perform in the European system for Bismarck. That function, that role to play, is as a buffer, a potential ally, and a counterweight. And this is where politics gets kinda tricky, because it's nice to survive, but now there's strings attached. The moment that function disappears, so does the protection, and so does the Austrian Empire. And so notice a pattern here emerging that I'm trying to communicate. Whenever Austria is dangling from the cliff by a single finger ready to fall, it's ultimately external forces that pull her back up to safety. This is what political scientists call a system-dependent state. Its existence is determined less by its own internal dynamics and more by whether the great powers that shape the international system want it to exist. And this brings us to 1914 and the First World War, where everything truly would change. When the war broke out in 1914, Austria-Hungary made what turned out to be a fatal strategic choice. She bound herself completely to Germany through the Dual Alliance, which had been formalized in 1879 and then expanded into the Triple Alliance with Italy in 1882. This may all actually seem very rational and beneficial. Germany and Austria-Hungary, after all, had German-dominated empires. They faced common enemies like big and scary Russia, and they had a long history of cooperation. But from a geopolitical perspective, this may have actually been a catastrophic miscalculation on the part of the Austrians. Because by tying itself to Germany, Austria-Hungary alienated the one power that had the greatest interest in keeping her alive. Surprise, surprise, it was Great Britain. Throughout the 19th century, British foreign policy had been based on maintaining a balance of power in Europe. Well, that may be the nice way of putting it, but the logic here is relatively straightforward. Britain cannot allow any single continental power from becoming strong enough to dominate the continent, because a unified Europe under one power would challenge everything. British naval supremacy would come into question. So would British colonial and commercial interests, and her industrial dominance too. This is why Napoleon was such a big deal with his continental system and nearly unifying the entire continent under his thumb. The British could literally not allow Napoleon to win because a strong Europe meant a weak and threatened Britain. So from the British perspective, you had to keep all the Europeans competing and fighting against each other. So long as they were destroying each other, keeping each other weak, they could not be a threat to you. So arm the Prussians, help the Russians and the Spanish too, ensure France is strong, but never strong enough, because that's the name of the game. If someone is losing a war in Europe, then help them out, but when they start winning, help out their enemy too, and so on. Austria-Hungary was essential to that balance because it occupied the geographic and political space between three potential hegemons. You had Russia to the east, Prussia and later a unified Germany to the north, and France to the west. To a lesser extent, you also had a newly unified Italy to the southwest. If Austria-Hungary didn't exist, then there would be nothing to stop Russia from expanding into Central Europe and the Balkans. Nothing to prevent Germany from dominating the continent, or potentially France for that matter, or Italy from becoming dominant on the Adriatic coast. And if there was nothing to create a buffer between these rival powers, that might drag Britain into a continental war because she would have to enforce the system herself. Hi everyone, I just want to take a quick pause in the video to give a huge thank you to Larry Dietrich, Daniel, Ellie Blue, B, and Neil. To those who don't know, I was recently demonetized by YouTube. Thankfully, now after 30 days, I've been brought back with my AdSense reopened. No explanation was ever given to me, but I guess I talk about some pretty wacky stuff. Anyhow, these awesome people were kind enough to become our very first supporters over on Patreon. Your support makes these sorts of in-depth historical videos possible, so once again, from the bottom of my heart, a big thank you. But now, let's get back to the story. But here is the problem for the British, because once Austria-Hungary becomes locked into an alliance with Germany, it is no longer serving British interests. In fact, it is now strengthening the one power that Britain viewed as the greatest threat to the European order. Prussia had already been strong enough to make the British scared, but now it was unified into Germany. And Austria-Hungary had transformed from being a buffer against German expansion into being an extension of German power. This is where we need to introduce a key concept that explains everything that happened next. The international system in 1914 was entering a period of transition. The British-led order that had dominated the 19th century was weakening. They had to finance the costs of the Boer War, compete with rising industrial goods from Germany, and maintain an enormous empire. At the same time, a new challenger was entering the field, the United States, with a completely different vision of how the world should be organized. Transitions like these between international orders are incredibly dangerous and chaotic periods, because the old rules stop working while at the same time the new rules haven't yet been established. The states that were protected under the old system suddenly become vulnerable, and that's exactly the position that Austria-Hungary was in. The British order was built on a balance of power, on maintaining several competing empires in Europe, so that no single one could dominate. Multinational states like Austria-Hungary were perfect and fit neatly into this system. But the new rising American vision, articulated most clearly by President Wilson, rested entirely on different principles. There would be self-determination, liberal democracy, open markets, and the rights of peoples rather than dynasties. These two visions were fundamentally incompatible, an idea I've touched on in previous videos. You cannot have both balance of power politics based on multinational empires and a system based on liberal democracies with self-determination. One or the other has to give way, and in 1918, with Britain exhausted and America ascendant, the old order was collapsing and the new one was rising. Now let's talk about what was actually happening to Austro-Hungary militarily by 1918, because the timing here is crucial. 1918 began with Germany pulling divisions from the Eastern Front after Russia just exploded and exited from the war. Partly because Germany had smuggled Lenin back into Russia, which is the geopolitical equivalent of starting a small fire to smoke out some wasps, and then watching it burn down half of Europe for the next 70 years. Anyways, these troops brought from the east were trained in the new stormtrooper tactics, and they would launch a series of massive spring offensives on the Western Front. The goal here was to try to win the war before American troops could arrive in decisive numbers. These offensives initially made spectacular gains. German troops advanced 40 miles, recaptured most of the territory lost in 1916, and came within just 50 miles of Paris, but the attacks came at an enormous cost. Germany would lose 600,000 of her best assault troops, extend her supply lines beyond sustainability, and exhaust her reserves. By July, the initiative had shifted again permanently to the Allies. At the same time, Austria-Hungary launched its own offensive on the Italian front in June of 1918. The operation was plagued by bad weather and rugged terrain. The railways, too, couldn't transport troops and supplies fast enough. And on the eve of the offensive, the Habsburg's army's food supplies could only last a few days. The attack made some initial progress, but it was quickly thrown back by Italian counterattacks. Austria-Hungary would lose some 143,000 men, and after this disaster, the situation only worsened rapidly. Disease spread through Habsburg forces. Troop numbers dropped from around 650,000 to 400,000 by September. This was mostly driven by desertions. So yes, the military and civil situation was desperate, and I'm not trying to hide that, but there is something important to understand. This doesn't actually explain the speed or the nature of the collapse. Because when the final crisis came in October of 1918, Austria-Hungary didn't just lose battles. The entire state structure disintegrated in a matter of weeks under everyone's feet. National councils sprang up across the empire, declaring independence and taking over the functions of government, with almost no resistance from the imperial bureaucracy at all. In Austria, this process was remarkably swift and bloodless. Emperor Charles abdicated on November 11th, and the last government resigned the same day. Military defeat doesn't itself automatically produce this kind of political collapse. These probably aren't perfect examples, but Russia lost disastrously in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. And the Tsar state survived another 12 years doing their thing. France was defeated and occupied by Germany in 1940 during World War II, but the French state continued to exist. And so it begs the question, what triggered the specific pattern of collapse that we see in Austria-Hungary? In a lot of my videos, I've already covered the absolute mess that was the internal politics of the empire. But in this video, I'd like to return us to the geopolitical dimension because it is essential and overlooked. On January 8th, 1918, President Wilson would deliver his 14 points to the United States Congress. Most of these points were pretty general and they were written in principle. There would be open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, and an impartial adjustment of colonial claims. But point 10 was aimed directly at Austria-Hungary, and it stated, "The peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development." Now let's read Mr. Wilson's points a little more carefully, because he's talking about peoples in plural, not a Habsburg state. He's talking about their autonomous development, which implies they should develop separately from the empire. This is a direct challenge to Austria-Hungary's legitimacy as a state. And it wasn't an isolated message. Throughout 1918 and 1917, Allied policy was moving towards supporting the dismemberment of the empire. In August of 1918, Britain officially recognized the Czechoslovak National Council in Paris as the legitimate government of a future Czechoslovakia. This happened while the Habsburg Empire still existed and was still technically at war. The French too would recognize the Polish National Committee. But why did this shift actually happen? Because the Allies didn't suddenly develop passionate feelings about Czechs or Poles and their independence. From 1914 to 1917, Allied policy was far more ambiguous towards Austria-Hungary. Some Allied leaders wanted to break up the empire, but others, particularly in Britain, thought Austro-Hungary should be preserved and just detached from her alliance with Germany. They hoped for a separate peace that would keep Austro-Hungary intact but neutral. But there are two main reasons that by 1918 there was a change in strategic calculation on the part of the Allies. First, Austro-Hungary had tied herself so closely to Germany that a separate peace at this point seemed impossible. The two empires had integrated their military commands, coordinated their war strategy, and become so economically dependent on each other through shared resources and supply lines. Any attempt by Austria-Hungary to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies would be seen by Germany as a betrayal. And Germany had the troops and the power on Austrian soil to just walk in and occupy Vienna if it was really necessary. More importantly, the Allies had tried to pursue a separate peace already with Austria-Hungary multiple times during the war. Most notably, this was in the secret negotiations of 1917, but these attempts had failed. It's honestly debatable how serious the Allies themselves were. The infamous Sixtus Affair, where Charles expressed secret peace overtures to France, ended up being leaked by the French themselves. This really destroyed what little credibility the Emperor had left with both the Allies and the Germans. After this debacle, even more than before, Austria-Hungary had to be treated as simply an extension of German power. And second, nationalist émigré groups, particularly the Czechoslovaks, had successfully convinced Allied leaders that breaking up Austro-Hungary was both possible and desirable. Their point was that independent nation-states carved out of Austria-Hungary would be more reliable partners than a reformed Habsburg Empire could ever be. A new Austria-Hungary, well, its loyalty would always be in question to the Allies. On the other hand, a new Czechoslovakia could serve as an industrial power and democratic barrier against German expansion. A larger Romania could form an eastern shield against the Bolsheviks, and bringing back a Polish state which was big enough to face off both the Germans and the Bolsheviks would certainly too be in Allied interests. Whether or not these claims were entirely accurate, they provided the Allies with a concrete alternative vision to simply preserving Austria-Hungary. And by mid-1918, that alternative vision had become Allied policy. What these émigré politicians did so successfully was wage a war of words and change the discourse about the way Allied leaders thought and talked about Austria-Hungary. Let me explain what I mean, because this is subtle but also important. In the 19th century, when British statesmen talked about Austria-Hungary, they used language like strategic necessity and stability. The empire was discussed as a permanent feature of European politics, something that had to be accommodated and preserved to serve British interests. But as World War I dragged on, a group of British writers and activists, including Henry Wickham Steed, Robert Seton Watson, and Louis Namur, began producing a completely different narrative. They argued that Austria-Hungary was an artificial creation and a relic of history that was doomed by its own internal contradictions. The empire's collapse was not just possible, but it was inevitable and desirable. Seton Watson in particular sticks out, and making this script, I tried to dig in as to why he landed on this view. It seems to me that at some point he flipped from having a reformist to a disintegrationist opinion on Austria-Hungary. But I couldn't actually find the answer, because there's a contradiction in public sources about what Seton Watson even advocated for before the war began. Some English language accounts that I found say he argued for federalizing Austria-Hungary to give autonomy to the subject peoples. But some other German sources say that in 1911 he wrote a book that already called for dissolving the empire entirely. But honestly, that's a different rabbit hole. What we do know for certain is this. By 1916, Seton Watson would go on to found a publication called The New Europe. And he financed it himself. The publication made it clear that he was fully committed to breaking up Austria-Hungary. So anyways, in 1917 and 18, Seton Watson would then work in British propaganda offices. He and Henry Wickham Steed would explicitly portray the monarchy as a German puppet and support the independence movements. This group of intellectuals were remarkably successful. Their narrative became the dominant way that Allied leaders understood Austria-Hungary. The idea that the empire was internally contradicting itself, that its subject peoples desperately wanted independence, and that its collapse would bring new and loyal partners for Britain, France, and the United States, this all became conventional wisdom. And so why does any of this actually matter? Well, because international politics is not just about material power. It's also about how situations are perceived and described. It's about controlling the narrative. It's like when your friend goes through a nasty breakup. The facts of the relationship have not changed, but suddenly everything their ex did gets reinterpreted as a red flag. Austria-Hungary was the same empire it had always been, but the story behind it had completely changed. And with this, whether true or not, the political space opened up for policies that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. To put this in some perspective, in the 19th century, Austria-Hungary's multinational character was projected as its strength. It was seen as proof that different peoples could coexist under enlightened imperial administration. But by 1918, the exact same multinational character was being presented as a fatal weakness, as proof that the empire had to be broken up. And I'm not really defending Austria-Hungary here, I'm just trying to say that the empire went from being defended by the most influential voices in British policy to being attacked by them. And the Habsburg elite really had no effective way to counter this. But here's the strange thing, because the underlying logic never actually died. After World War II, Winston Churchill supported creating a Danube Federation to keep Central Europe out of Soviet hands and counterbalance Germany. It's the same buffer logic just 30 years later. Otto von Habsburg was in New York lobbying for exactly this, but Stalin ended up vetoing it. The point is that the British strategic instinct to want something like Austria-Hungary didn't disappear. It was really just overridden in 1918 by the circumstances, when the war forced a choice between preserving some sort of form of Austria-Hungary and defeating Germany. Then the empire became expendable. The final blow would come in September of 1918 when Bulgaria, one of the Central Powers, collapsed. An Allied offensive launched from Greece defeated the Bulgarian army, which was itself starving and demoralized. On September 30th, Bulgaria signed an unconditional surrender to the Allied powers, and this was catastrophic. With the Balkan front now opened up, there was a direct path for Allied armies to march into Hungary. The Serbian army, which had been fighting from exile, immediately took this opportunity and began advancing in this direction. On October 3rd, both Germany and Austria-Hungary appealed to President Wilson for an armistice based on his 14 points. But Wilson's response made it clear that he would not negotiate with the existing imperial governments. His condition was that the old ruling elites had to be replaced before any armistice could be concluded. For Austria-Hungary, this created an impossible situation. The government needed an armistice to stop the fighting and prevent its collapse. But to get an armistice, it needed to transform itself politically. Any such transformation would likely trigger the exact nationalist revolts and collapse that the government was trying to prevent. In response, Emperor Charles tried to thread the needle with his new manifesto of October 16th. In it, he promised that the empire would become a federal state with autonomous rights for all the different nationalities. He hoped that this would satisfy Wilson's demands while preserving the empire itself. Essentially, eating your cake but having it too. The thing is, the manifesto triggered immediate collapse. Nationalist councils across the different territories interpreted the promise of autonomy as permission to declare full independence. And within days, these councils had now established functioning governments that had taken over the administration because they could see which way the wind was blowing. Now you might ask, if Austria-Hungary only collapsed because the great powers abandoned it, why couldn't it adapt? Why couldn't Charles reform the empire fast enough to find a new function within the existing global system? And this is where internal factors really do matter, not as the primary cause of collapse, but as the reason the empire couldn't save itself. As I've discussed in previous videos, there were real constitutional problems within Austria-Hungary. There was a rigid Ausgleich that gave Hungarians veto power over any real reform. There was a failure to accommodate the Slavic peoples of the empire. And there was of course the fact that any concession to one nationality threatened the privileges of another. And it all created an internal situation that could not react properly to external reality, especially one that was changing. The Habsburg army would disintegrate in tandem with the state. Between October 20th and 28th, multiple divisions mutinied or simply stopped following their orders. It's fair to say that when Italy launched her final offensive on October 24th, it was attacking an army that had already ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice at Padua. On November 11th, Emperor Charles would relinquish all participation in government. And with that, the Habsburg Empire was over. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. The military situation was really terrible, yes. The economy was in ruins and probably worse than the military situation, absolutely yes. But empires throughout history have survived worse when the international system around them needed them to survive. What made 1918 so different was that the world realized it no longer needed an Austria-Hungary at all. The old British-led order that had protected Austria-Hungary was collapsing and its narrative had shifted. The rising American order delegitimized dynastic imperial rule and instead favored states organized around a dominant national identity, even if they contained significant minorities. From the perspective of the new order being constructed, Austria-Hungary was now an obstacle. In 1918, they wanted to create nation-states that could counter German power and be strong bulwarks against the spread of Bolshevism from Russia. And that's exactly what they got. The Paris Peace Conference did not break up Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary had already broken herself up. What the conference did formalize was a collapse that had already happened, while making clear who the new order actually favored. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia sat as allied powers presenting their claims. The new Austria and Hungary sat as defeated enemies awaiting their judgment. The peoples who had all been Habsburg subjects months earlier were now deciding its fate. Many in these new states genuinely wanted independence. Their movements were real and so were their grievances. But those movements alone don't explain why 1918 succeeded where every previous attempt failed. And there is another dimension to this because the principles announced at the Paris Peace Conference, driven by the new American order such as self-determination and national rights, were applied selectively. When self-determination supported Allied interests, then it was upheld, but when it conflicted, it was largely ignored. An obvious example is that Czechoslovakia needed the Sudetenland strategically to survive. So self-determination was not applied to the Germans living there. A more niche example may be Yugoslavia and Italy fighting over Dalmatia. The Treaty of London in 1915 had promised these territories to Italy. But by 1918, the Allies wanted a strong Yugoslavia to counter Italian ambitions in the Balkans. And so it was refused to recognize the Italian claim, citing self-determination of the peoples living there. But I need to stop myself from going on a tangent here because it's 3 in the morning as I'm recording this and I gotta chill out and stop drinking so much Monster Energy. This is not a video about litigating the post-war peace conferences. It's a video that's actually pretty cynical at its core. What really decides whether states live or die? It's not about principles or destiny, but it's about power and whether the people who have it find you useful.